The morning sun was already blazing hot over the Nevada desert when Harold stepped out of his old pickup truck. At 78 years old, he moved a bit slower than he used to, but his eyes still sparkled with the same excitement he'd felt as a young man whenever he heard jet engines roar overhead. Today was special. His granddaughter had surprised him with a ticket to the Thunderbird air show for his birthday last month. She knew how much he loved anything that flew, and this was going to be the biggest air show in the state this year. Harold had been looking forward to it for weeks. He reached back into the truck and pulled out his old military jacket. The green fabric was faded now, softer than it used to be from years of wear. Patches covered both sleeves and the chest. Colorful squares and circles that told stories most people wouldn't understand. Some showed eagles with spread wings. Others had numbers and letters that meant nothing to civilians. There was one patch that looked like lightning bolts, another with a fierce-looking bird clutching arrows. Harold slipped the jacket on despite the desert heat. It felt right wearing it here, among the planes and the people who came to watch them fly. This jacket had been with him through a lot, and today felt like the kind of day where he should wear it with pride. The parking lot was already packed with cars, trucks, and RVs. Families were unpacking coolers and folding chairs. Kids ran around with toy airplanes in their hands, making whooshing sounds as they pretended to be pilots. The smell of sunscreen and barbecue filled the air, mixed with the distant scent of jet fuel that made Harold's heart beat a little faster. He walked toward the entrance gates. Harold could hear the announcer's voice echoing across the airfield, welcoming everyone to the show. The sound of engines warming up rumbled in the background, like distant thunder. He fumbled in his pocket for his ticket, his weathered hands taking a moment to find it among his wallet and keys. "Excuse me, sir. Are you okay?" A young woman at the gate noticed him struggling with his ticket. Her voice wasn't mean, just concerned that maybe the old man needed help. "Oh, I'm fine, thank you," Harold replied with a gentle smile. "Just excited to be here. Been looking forward to this for quite a while." She scanned his ticket and handed it back. "Well, you picked a great day for it. They've got some amazing aircraft lined up. The A-10 demonstration is supposed to be incredible." Harold's eyes lit up at the mention of the A-10. "Now that's something I'd definitely like to see," he said, his voice carrying more enthusiasm than the gate attendant expected from someone his age. Walking through the entrance, Harold was amazed at how big everything was. The airfield stretched out like a small city, with aircraft parked in neat rows along the tarmac. People were everywhere, thousands of them, all here for the same reason he was. Some were clearly military folks, easy to spot by their haircuts and the way they carried themselves. Others were families with kids who could barely contain their excitement. Harold made his way through the crowd, using his wooden cane to help navigate around groups of people who had stopped to take pictures or read the information boards about different aircraft. The cane wasn't fancy, just a simple wooden stick his doctor had suggested he use after his hip surgery last year. But it did the job, and today it was helping him get to where he wanted to be. As he walked, he couldn't help but notice some of the looks he was getting. A group of teenagers pointed at his jacket and whispered to each other, snickering behind their hands. He caught bits of their conversation as he passed by. "Look at all those patches," one of them said with a smirk. "Probably thinks he's some kind of war hero or something. My dad says you can buy those online now," another added. "Anyone can dress up and pretend they were in the military." Harold kept walking, pretending not to hear them. He'd encountered this kind of thing before. Young people today didn't always understand what the patches meant, and he didn't blame them for that. The world had changed a lot since his time in service. He found a good spot near the flight line, close enough to see the aircraft clearly, but far enough back to stay safe. The fence separated the crowd from the active runway, but Harold could see everything perfectly from where he stood. He set down his small backpack and pulled out a pair of binoculars, old ones with worn leather straps. But they still worked perfectly. "Those look like they belong in a museum," someone behind him commented loudly enough for others to hear. Harold turned around to see a man in his 30s wearing an expensive-looking polo shirt and designer sunglasses. "You might want to upgrade to something from this century, Grandpa." A few people around them chuckled. Harold just nodded politely and turned back toward the airfield. He'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially not here at an event meant to celebrate aviation. The first aircraft of the day was already taxiing toward the runway, a sleek F-16 that gleamed silver in the morning sun. Harold raised his binoculars and watched as the pilot ran through his pre-flight checks. Even from this distance, he could see the careful, methodical way the pilot moved through his routine. "Look at him," the same man from before said to his friends. "Acting like he knows what he's looking at. Probably never been closer to a fighter jet than the movies." Harold tried to ignore the comments, but they were getting harder to tune out. More people seemed to be paying attention to him, now, and not in a good way. Some were taking pictures with their phones, probably thinking it was funny to see an old man dressed up like a veteran. A woman with perfectly styled hair and expensive jewelry leaned over to her friend. "I don't understand why they let people dress up like that," she said, not bothering to lower her voice. "It's disrespectful to real veterans." The words stung more than Harold wanted to admit. He gripped his cane a little tighter and focused on the F-16 as it roared down the runway and lifted into the bright blue sky. The sound of the jet engine drowned out the whispers around him, at least for a moment. But as the aircraft climbed higher and the noise faded, the comments started again. This time it was a group of college-aged kids who seemed to think the whole situation was hilarious. "Hey, check out Captain America over here," one of them said, pointing at Harold's jacket. "Think he'll salute when the planes fly by? Probably expects everyone to thank him for his service," another added with a laugh. Harold felt his face getting warm, but he wasn't sure if it was from embarrassment or anger, maybe both. He'd come here to enjoy the aircraft, to remember better times, and to feel connected to something he'd always loved. Instead, he was being treated like some kind of joke, but he didn't leave. He didn't take off his jacket or put away his binoculars. Instead, he stood a little straighter, adjusted his grip on his cane, and kept his eyes on the sky. Because despite what these people thought, despite their cruel words and mocking laughter, Harold belonged here just as much as anyone else, maybe more than most. The air show was in full swing now, and Harold found himself getting lost in the beauty of it all. Despite the uncomfortable comments from the crowd around him, he couldn't help but feel his heart lift every time another aircraft took to the sky. This was what he'd come for. The roar of engines, the precision of aerial maneuvers, the incredible skill of the pilots who made flying look effortless. A massive C-130 transport plane was approaching the runway, its four propellers creating a distinctive low rumble that Harold recognized immediately. He raised his binoculars and watched as the huge aircraft lined up for what looked like a demonstration landing. The crowd around him was mostly quiet, watching with casual interest, but Harold was completely focused. "That's a Hercules," he said, softly to himself, but loud enough that a few people nearby could hear him. "Four-engine turboprop, probably carrying about 60,000 pounds. Look how steady she comes in." The teenagers who had been making fun of him earlier turned around, clearly annoyed that the old man was still talking about airplanes like he knew what he was saying. "Oh great, now he's giving us a lecture," one of them said with exaggerated annoyance. "What's next? Gonna tell us you flew one of those too?" Harold didn't answer, but he couldn't help smiling slightly as the C-130 touched down exactly where he'd predicted it would, right on the numbers painted on the runway. The pilot had judged the approach perfectly, just like Harold had seen hundreds of times before. "Lucky guess," another teenager muttered, but Harold noticed that more people were starting to pay attention to what he was saying about the aircraft. Next up was a formation of 3 F-18 Hornets, flying so close together their wingtips seemed to be almost touching. The crowd gasped as the jets screamed overhead in perfect synchronization, their blue and gold paint schemes brilliant against the desert sky. Harold lowered his binoculars and turned to a young boy standing nearby with his parents. The kid was maybe 8 years old, eyes wide with wonder at the jets overhead. "You know what's really amazing about that?" Harold asked the boy gently. "Those pilots are flying about 2 feet apart at over 400 miles per hour. Takes years of training to do that safely." The little boy's eyes got even wider. "Really? How do they not crash into each other?" "Lots of practice," Harold replied with a warm smile. "And trust. They have to trust each other completely. But before he could say more, the boy's father stepped between them, giving Harold a suspicious look. "Come on, buddy," the father said to his son. "Let's find a better spot to watch." He led the boy away, but not before Harold heard him mutter to his wife, "Don't want him bothering strangers." Harold felt a familiar pang in his chest. He'd only been trying to share his love of aviation with a kid who seemed genuinely interested. But he understood why parents were cautious these days. The mockery was getting worse, though. The group of college students had grown larger, and they seemed to think Harold was some kind of entertainment. One of them had pulled out his phone and was recording Harold watching the air show. "This is hilarious," the student said to his friends while pointing the camera at Harold. "Look at this guy acting like he's some kind of expert. Bet he's never even been on a plane. Should we ask him which war he fought in?" Another student suggested with a nasty grin. "Vietnam? World War II? Maybe the Civil War?" They all laughed at that, and Harold felt his cheeks burning. He was 78, not 178, but he kept his mouth shut and tried to focus on the next aircraft coming in for its demonstration. It was a beautiful P-51 Mustang, a World War II fighter that had been restored to perfect condition. The distinctive sound of its Merlin engine made Harold's heart skip a beat. He'd always loved the Mustangs. They were before his time in terms of military service, but he'd flown one once at an air show years ago, back when he was still active duty. "That's a P-51, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "Probably has the original Packard Merlin engine. Listen to that sound, like nothing else in the world." The man in the expensive polo shirt from earlier overheard him and rolled his eyes dramatically. "Here we go again with the Wikipedia facts," he said loudly. "Next he'll be telling us he flew one of those too." "Actually," Harold started to say, but caught himself. What was the point? These people had already decided who they thought he was. The Mustang pilot was putting on an incredible show, diving and climbing, rolling and turning with the grace that only comes from years of experience. Harold watched through his binoculars, completely absorbed in the performance. He could see the pilot's technique, the way he managed his energy, the perfect timing of each maneuver. "Look at him," one of the college students said, still recording with his phone. "He's probably pretending he's the pilot up there, living in some fantasy world. I bet those patches on his jacket are fake," another voice added. "You can buy anything online these days. Probably never served a day in his life." That comment hit Harold harder than the others. His jaw tightened, and his grip on his cane became white-knuckled. Those patches weren't fake. Each one represented months or years of his life. Missions he'd flown, people he'd served with, some of whom never made it home. But he didn't say anything. He just kept watching the Mustang as it climbed high into the desert sky, its silver wings, catching the sunlight like a piece of heaven itself. The worst moment came when Harold dropped his water bottle. He'd been reaching into his backpack for his old flight manual, a worn book he'd brought along because it had notes in the margins about some of the aircraft that would be performing today. As he pulled it out, his water bottle fell from where he'd tucked it beside him. The bottle rolled a few feet away, and Harold started to get up to retrieve it. But his hip was stiff from standing so long, and he moved slowly, carefully, using his cane for support. "Timber!" someone shouted mockingly as Harold stood up. "Careful there, Pops, don't want you breaking a hip." Several people laughed, and Harold felt his face burn with embarrassment. He made his way over to his water bottle, picked it up, and walked back to his spot as dignified as he could manage. But the college student with the phone had captured the whole thing, and Harold could hear him narrating for his recording. "And here we see the ancient war hero in his natural habitat, struggling with basic motor functions but still pretending to be an expert on military aircraft. Maybe someone should call the nursing home," another voice added. "Tell them one of their residents wandered off." Harold sat down heavily on the small folding stool he'd brought with him. His hands were shaking slightly. Whether from anger, embarrassment, or just the heat, he wasn't sure. Maybe all three. An older woman standing nearby looked at him with what might have been sympathy, but when her husband whispered something in her ear, she looked away quickly. Harold realized that even the people who might have been kind to him were staying quiet, not wanting to associate themselves with the target of so much ridicule. He opened his water bottle and took a long drink, trying to calm himself down. The next aircraft was already approaching. He could hear the distinctive whine of jet engines spooling up. Whatever it was, he was determined to enjoy watching it fly, no matter what anyone else said about him, because that's what he'd come here for. The aircraft, the flying, the reminder of everything he'd once been part of, everything that had shaped his life, even if no one else believed it anymore. The announcer's voice crackled over the loudspeakers, cutting through the desert heat and the murmur of the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, prepare yourselves for something truly special. Coming in for demonstration is the A-10 Thunderbolt II, better known as the Warthog. This incredible aircraft has been the backbone of close air support for over 4 decades. Harold's entire body straightened when he heard those words. He set down his water bottle and gripped his binoculars so tightly his knuckles went white. After all the mockery, after all the cruel comments, this was the moment he'd been waiting for, without even realizing it. In the distance, he could see it approaching. That unmistakable silhouette that had been burned into his memory for more years than he cared to count. The twin engines mounted high on the fuselage, the straight wings built for low-altitude flying, the distinctive nose that housed the most fearsome gun ever put on an aircraft. Even from miles away, Harold could identify every line, every curve, every detail of the A-10. "There she is," he whispered. And for the first time all day, his voice carried pure joy instead of the quiet dignity he'd been maintaining despite the ridicule. The college students who had been tormenting him were still nearby, still recording with their phones, still making jokes. But something in Harold's voice must have caught their attention because one of them looked over at him with mild curiosity. "What's so special about this one, old-timer?" the student asked, not entirely mockingly this time. "Looks like a flying brick to me." Harold couldn't help himself. The sight of the A-10 approaching had awakened something deep inside him, something that 40 years of civilian life hadn't been able to completely bury. "She's not pretty," Harold said, his eyes never leaving the aircraft as it grew larger in the distance. "Never was meant to be. She's built around that gun, a GAU-8 Avenger, 7 barrels, fires 30mm rounds at 3,900 rounds per minute. The whole airplane is basically a flying gun platform." The student blinked, clearly not expecting such a detailed answer. A few other people nearby had started listening too, including some adults who seemed genuinely interested. "The pilot sits in a titanium bathtub," Harold continued, his voice growing stronger and more confident. "Armor thick enough to stop most ground fire. Those engines are mounted high so they don't suck up debris during low-level attacks. Everything about her is designed for one mission, protecting the troops on the ground." The A-10 was close enough now that everyone could hear its distinctive sound, not the sharp scream of a fighter jet, but a deeper, more menacing rumble from those twin turbofan engines. The pilot was bringing it in low, probably no more than 500 feet above the crowd. "Why are the engines so far back?" asked the same student, and Harold was surprised to hear genuine curiosity in his voice instead of mockery. "Survivability," Harold replied immediately. "If one engine gets hit, the other can still get you home, and they're positioned so the aircraft can still fly even with half a wing blown off. I've seen A-10s make it back to base with damage that would have brought down any other aircraft." The expensive polo shirt man from earlier had been listening and couldn't resist jumping in. "Oh, please," he said loudly. Now he's acting like he's seen combat. "What's next? Gonna tell us war stories?" But Harold barely heard him. The A-10 was directly overhead now, and the pilot was beginning the demonstration. The aircraft banked into a tight turn, and Harold could see the pilot in the cockpit, could imagine exactly what he was feeling up there. The slight G-force pushing him into his seat, the responsive controls, the incredible view of the desert stretching out below. "Watch this," Harold said, raising his binoculars again. "He's going to do a gun run demonstration. See how he's lining up? Perfect angle of attack, just like the manual says." Sure enough, the A-10 straightened out and began a shallow dive toward a target area set up on the far side of the airfield. Even though no actual ammunition would be fired during the air show, the pilot was demonstrating the exact technique used in combat situations. Harold found himself unconsciously leaning forward, his body remembering the feel of those same controls, the weight of that same aircraft responding to his commands. His breathing had changed too, deeper, more focused, like he was right back in the cockpit himself. "Look at his airspeed management," Harold said, more to himself than anyone else. "Keeps it steady at about 300 knots, gives him time to line up the shot and pull out safely. Too fast and you can't aim properly, too slow and you're a sitting duck for ground fire." A middle-aged woman standing nearby looked at Harold with new interest. "You seem to know a lot about this plane," she said, her tone more respectful than anything he'd heard all day. "The A-10 is special," Harold replied, his eyes still tracking the aircraft as it pulled up from its simulated attack run. "She saved more lives than any other aircraft in the Air Force. When ground troops are in trouble, when they're surrounded and outgunned, this is what they call for. This is what shows up to bring them home." The A-10 was climbing now, preparing for another demonstration pass. The pilot rolled the aircraft slightly, showing off its surprisingly agile handling despite its ungainly appearance. Harold smiled as he watched the maneuver. He remembered doing the same thing himself decades ago, showing off for crowds who had no idea what they were really seeing. "My grandson is deployed overseas right now," the woman said quietly. "Army, infantry. He's told me about hearing these planes when things got bad. Said it was the most beautiful sound in the world." Harold turned to look at her, and she could see something in his eyes that made her pause. There was knowledge there, and experience, and a deep understanding that went far beyond anything you could learn from books or documentaries. "Your grandson is right," Harold said gently. "When you're on the ground and everything's going wrong, when you think you might not make it home, the sound of an A-10 coming to help you is better than angels singing." The college student who had been recording, him lowered his phone slightly. Something in Harold's voice had changed, become more serious, more real. The mockery in the student's expression was starting to fade, replaced by uncertainty. The A-10 was setting up for another pass, this time demonstrating its ability to fly slow and low for close observation of ground targets. The pilot brought the aircraft down to what looked like dangerously low altitude, flying just above the runway at barely 200 feet. "Jesus," someone in the crowd muttered. "How is he flying that slow without stalling?" "She can fly as slow as 120 knots when she needs to," Harold explained. "Those big straight wings give her incredible lift at low speeds, means she can loiter over a battlefield for hours, providing cover for ground troops. Most fighters have to make quick passes and leave. The A-10 can stay and fight." The aircraft passed directly overhead, and Harold could see the pilot clearly through the cockpit canopy. For just a moment it seemed like the pilot was looking down at the crowd, scanning the faces below. Harold raised his hand in a small wave, not expecting any response, just a gesture of respect from one aviator to another. But something extraordinary happened. The A-10 pilot seemed to pause in his scan of the crowd, his attention caught by something in the section where Harold was standing. The aircraft continued its pass, but Harold could swear the pilot had noticed him specifically. "Did you see that?" the woman next to him asked. "I think the pilot saw you wave." Harold wasn't sure, but he felt something stirring in his chest, a hope he hadn't felt in years. The A-10 had completed its demonstration routine and was circling back for what everyone assumed would be the final pass before heading back to base. Harold watched through his binoculars as the pilot set up for another low approach, probably planning to wave goodbye to the crowd before departing. But something was different this time. Instead of the smooth, predictable pattern the pilot had been flying all afternoon, the A-10 was making tighter turns, coming in lower than before. Harold lowered his binoculars, confused by what he was seeing. "What's he doing?" the woman next to him asked, shading her eyes with her hand as she tried to follow the aircraft's unusual flight path. Harold didn't answer immediately. He was studying the A-10's movements with the trained eye of someone who had flown the same aircraft for years. The pilot wasn't just showboating. There was purpose in every turn, every adjustment of altitude and speed. The college students who had been making fun of Harold were still nearby, though their mockery had died down somewhat after hearing his detailed knowledge of the aircraft. One of them was still recording with his phone, but he seemed more interested in the unusual flying than in making jokes about the old man. "This isn't normal," Harold said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. He's looking for something. The Ike? A-10 was flying a search pattern now, making slow passes over different sections of the crowd. The pilot was clearly scanning the spectators below, and the aircraft's movements had become deliberate and focused rather than showy. The announcer's voice came over the loudspeakers, but he sounded confused. "Ladies and gentlemen, it appears our A-10 pilot is... Well, he seems to be taking an extended look at our wonderful audience today." The crowd was starting to murmur among themselves. This wasn't part of the scheduled demonstration. People began pointing and speculating about what was happening. Some seemed worried, wondering if there was some kind of emergency or security issue. But Harold had a different feeling entirely. His heart was starting to beat faster, and he found himself standing straighter, unconsciously coming to attention. Something deep in his military training was telling him to be ready, though he wasn't sure for what. The A-10 completed another slow pass, this time flying directly over the section where Harold was standing. The pilot was definitely looking down at the crowd, his helmeted head moving back and forth as he searched faces below. Then it happened. The aircraft suddenly slowed even more and began to hover, as much as an A-10 could hover, directly above Harold's area of the crowd. The twin engines' rumble became a steady, powerful presence overhead, and everyone in that section instinctively looked up. Harold felt like his heart might stop. He knew, somehow he just knew, that the pilot was looking at him specifically. After 40 years of civilian life, after a morning of mockery and disrespect, something was about to happen that would change everything. The A-10's external communication system crackled to life. Most people in the crowd had never heard a military aircraft address spectators directly, and a hush fell over the entire airfield. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the pilot's voice, professional but carrying an undertone of excitement. "I apologize for departing from our scheduled demonstration, but I've spotted something down there that I simply cannot ignore." The crowd was completely silent now. Even the college students had stopped talking and were looking up at the aircraft, with wide eyes. Harold felt his hands trembling slightly as he gripped his cane. "Sir, in the military jacket near Section C." The pilot's voice continued. "Could you please raise your hand so everyone can see you?" Every head in Harold's section turned toward him. The teenagers who had been mocking him earlier stared in shock. The man in the expensive polo shirt looked confused and slightly annoyed that his entertainment for the day was being interrupted. Harold hesitated for just a moment. Part of him wanted to disappear, to avoid whatever was about to happen. But something stronger, the part of him that had once worn the uniform with pride, made him slowly raise his weathered hand above his head. "Thank you, sir," the pilot's voice boomed across the airfield. "Now, I'm going to ask you something, and I hope you'll indulge an old A-10 driver with an answer. What's your call sign?" The question hit Harold like a punch to the gut. His call sign. Nobody had asked him that in decades. It belonged to a different life, a different version of himself that most people would never believe existed. The crowd around him was staring, waiting. The college student with the phone had it raised again, recording everything. Harold could feel the weight of thousands of eyes on him. He cleared his throat and called out, his voice stronger than it had been all day. "Thunderhawk." The word carried across the airfield, and Harold saw several older veterans in the crowd straighten up. With recognition, call signs weren't just nicknames. They were earned, and they meant something in the military aviation community. The A-10 pilot's response sent a shockwave through the entire crowd. "Colonel Harold Thunderhawk Martinez," the pilot announced, his voice filled with genuine respect and awe. "Distinguished Flying Cross recipient, Bronze Star with V Device for Valor and Air Force Cross. 127 combat missions in A-10 Thunderbolts over Afghanistan and Iraq." The college students who had been recording Harold looked at each other in confusion and growing embarrassment. The man in the polo shirt's mouth fell open. The woman who had been kind to Harold gasped and put her hand to her chest, but the pilot wasn't finished. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're looking down there isn't just any airshow spectator. Colonel Martinez was one of the original test pilots for the A-10 program in the 1970s. He helped develop the tactics and procedures that A-10 pilots still use today. The close air support techniques that have saved thousands of American lives, he helped write that book. Harold felt tears starting to form in his eyes. He hadn't expected this, hadn't wanted the attention, but hearing his accomplishments spoken aloud, hearing the respect in the young pilot's voice, brought back memories he had buried under decades of quiet civilian life. "Sir," the pilot continued, "those patches on your jacket aren't just decorations. They're a roadmap of service to this country that spans over 3 decades. You flew rescue missions that brought soldiers home to their families. You provided air support that turned the tide in battles most Americans will never even hear about." The crowd around Harold had gone completely silent. The mockery, the cruel comments, the dismissive looks, all of it evaporated in the face of the truth that was being broadcast across the entire airfield. And Colonel Martinez, the pilot's voice took on an even more personal tone. "The tactical innovations you developed for urban close air support, I used those procedures just last year in Syria. Your work didn't just save lives in your war, sir. It's still saving lives today." Harold could no longer hold back the tears. They streamed down his weathered cheeks as he looked up at the A-10 hovering overhead. The young pilot up there was carrying on a tradition that Harold had helped create, flying missions using techniques that Harold had risked his life to develop and perfect. The college student who had been recording slowly lowered his phone, his face pale with the realization of how wrong he had been. The teenagers who had made fun of Harold's patches were staring at him with expressions of shock and dawning respect. Harold raised his hand again, this time in a proper military salute, toward the aircraft overhead. The entire airfield had fallen into a silence so complete that even the distant hum of other aircraft seemed to fade away. Harold stood with his hand raised in salute, tears flowing freely down his cheeks, while the A-10 hovered overhead like a guardian angel made of metal and memories. The pilot's voice came through the speakers one more time, but now it carried a different tone. Not the formal announcement voice, but something more personal, more emotional. "Colonel Martinez, would you do me the honor of allowing me to land and meet you properly? I think there are a few thousand people here who owe you their thanks, and I'd like to be the first in line." Harold could barely find his voice, but he managed to call out, "It would be my honor, Captain." The A-10 began its approach to the runway, and Harold watched through blurred vision as the aircraft he had helped design and test came in for a perfect landing. The same aircraft that had been his life's work, that had carried him through combat missions most people couldn't imagine, was coming back to him after all these years. Around him, the crowd was beginning to react. The college student who had been recording Harold earlier was staring at his phone screen, probably realizing that what he had captured was something much more powerful than the joke he had intended to make. His hands were shaking as he looked back and forth between his phone and Harold. I'm sorry," the student stammered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know, I'm so sorry." Harold looked at the young man, really looked at him for the first time. He saw embarrassment and genuine regret in the kid's eyes, and something in Harold's heart softened. These young people hadn't known. How could they have known? "It's okay, son," Harold said quietly, his voice still thick with emotion. "You couldn't have known. I don't wear my service on my sleeve anymore." The teenagers who had been making fun of his patches were huddled together, whispering urgently among themselves. One of them, a girl who couldn't have been more than 17, broke away from the group and approached Harold hesitantly. "Sir," she said, her voice shaking, "we were really awful to you today. We said terrible things. I want you to know how sorry I am." Harold reached out and gently touched her shoulder. "Young lady, you remind me of my granddaughter. She's about your age, and she makes mistakes too. The important thing is that you learn from them." Meanwhile, the A-10 had taxied off the runway and was approaching the crowd area. Airshow officials were scrambling to set up barriers and create a safe space for what was clearly going to be an impromptu meet and greet. The announcer, still sounding amazed by what was happening, was trying to explain to the crowd what they were witnessing. "Folks, in 30 years of announcing air shows, I have never seen anything like this." His voice crackled through the speakers. What we're witnessing is a reunion between a legendary pilot and the aircraft that defined his career. The woman who had been kind to Harold earlier, the one whose grandson was deployed overseas, was crying openly now. She approached Harold and, without saying a word, gave him a gentle hug. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything you did, for my grandson, for all of them." Harold hugged her back, feeling the weight of decades of unspoken gratitude in that simple gesture. This was why he had served, why he had risked everything in those cockpits so many years ago, for people like this woman, for families like hers, for the freedom to stand in a desert airfield and watch aircraft perform in peace instead of war. The A-10 had stopped now, its engines winding down to a quiet idle. The canopy opened, and Harold could see the pilot climbing out. Even from a distance he could tell it was a woman, something that filled his heart with pride. When he had started flying A-10s, there were no female combat pilots. The progress made him smile through his tears. The pilot removed her helmet as she walked toward the crowd, and Harold could see she was young, probably in her 30s, with the confident bearing that came from years of flying dangerous missions. She approached the barrier where Harold was standing, and the crowd parted respectfully to let her through. "Colonel Martinez," she said, coming to attention and rendering a perfect salute. "Captain Rodriguez, 354th Fighter Squadron. It is an absolute honor to meet you, sir." Harold returned the salute, his muscle memory taking over after all these years. "The honor is mine, Captain. That was some beautiful flying up there." "Thank you, sir, but I have to say, everything I did up there, I learned from the manual you helped write. Your innovations in low-altitude tactics, your work on survivability, techniques, they're still saving lives every day." She reached into her flight suit and pulled out a worn book, the same A-10 tactical manual that Harold had helped develop decades earlier. The pages were dog-eared and marked with notes, showing how thoroughly it had been studied. "I keep this with me on every deployment," Captain Rodriguez explained. "My squadron commander gave it to me when I finished A-10 training. He said it was written by one of the greatest warthog drivers who ever lived. I just never imagined I'd get to meet you in person." Harold looked at the manual, recognizing his own handwriting in some of the margin notes visible through the plastic cover pages. It was surreal seeing his life's work being carried forward by this young pilot who represented everything good about the next generation of warriors. Would you mind signing it?" Captain Rodriguez asked, her professional composure cracking slightly to reveal the eager young pilot underneath. "Of course," Harold replied, accepting the manual and a pen. He thought for a moment about what to write, then carefully inscribed, "To Captain Rodriguez, fly safe, bring them home. The tradition continues. Colonel Harold Thunderhawk Martinez." As he handed the manual back, the crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. People were crying, cheering, taking pictures and videos, but now it was different. Now they were documenting something beautiful instead of cruel. They were witnessing history, seeing a living legend get the recognition he had never sought but absolutely deserved. The man in the expensive polo shirt who had been so cruel earlier pushed through the crowd, his face red with embarrassment. He approached Harold hesitantly, clearly struggling with what to say. "Sir, I was completely out of line today. I said things that were inexcusable. I don't know how to apologize for that kind of behavior." Harold looked at him for a long moment, then extended his hand. "We all have bad days," he said simply. "What matters is what we do next." The man shook Harold's hand with obvious relief and gratitude, then quietly melted back into the crowd. Captain Rodriguez spent the next hour with Harold, walking around her aircraft and listening as he pointed out details and shared stories from his test pilot days. The crowd followed at a respectful distance, hanging on every word as Harold explained how certain design features had come about, what modifications had been made over the years, and how the A-10 had evolved from his era to hers. "The most important thing," Harold told Captain Rodriguez as they stood beside the aircraft's fearsome GAU-8 cannon, "is never forget why we fly these machines. It's not about the technology or the glory. It's about the soldier on the ground who's counting on you to bring him home safely." As the day wound down, and it came time for Captain Rodriguez to depart, she made one final announcement over the aircraft's communication system. Ladies and gentlemen, today you've met a true American hero. Colonel Martinez represents the very best of what our military services produce: courage, dedication, and a lifetime of selfless service. I'm honored to carry on the traditions he helped establish. Harold watched as the A-10 taxied away, then lifted off into the desert sky one more time. As it disappeared into the distance, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the deep satisfaction of knowing that his life's work was in good hands. The crowd began to disperse, but many people stopped to shake Harold's hand, thank him for his service, or simply tell him how moved they had been by what they had witnessed. The college students who had tormented him earlier waited until almost everyone else had left, then approached him one final time. Colonel Martinez, the student who had been recording, said, "I want you to know that I'm going to delete that video I took of you earlier. It was wrong and I'm ashamed of it." Harold smiled and put a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Actually, son, I'd like you to keep it. But maybe you could add something to the end. A reminder that you never know who you're looking at when you see someone different from yourself. Sometimes the most ordinary-looking people have the most extraordinary stories." As Harold walked back to his pickup truck, his heart was full in a way it hadn't been for decades. Today had started as just another air show, another day of quiet anonymity. But it had become something much more. A reminder that service to country never really ends, and that the bonds forged in defense of freedom last a lifetime. His patches weren't just decorations on an old jacket. They were pieces of his soul, fragments of a life spent in service to something greater than himself. And today, for the first time in 40 years, everyone else could see them too.